And This hearing will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing entitled Software Update Required. COVID-19 Exposes Need for Federal Investments in Technology. I want to welcome our witnesses who are here with us today. At the outset, I want to welcome I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess at any time to address technical difficulties that may arise with such remote proceedings. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, we are holding this hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. First, consistent with regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when they are recognized for their 5 minutes. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute you under any other conditions. Second, members must have their cameras on throughout this proceeding and must be visible on screen in order to be recognized. As a reminder, members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. Finally, to maintain safety in light of the attending physician's new guidance, any members present in the hearing room must wear a mask at all times when they are not speaking. For those members not wanting to wear a mask, the House rules provide a way to participate remotely from your office without being physically present in the hearing room. Now I will introduce our witnesses. This afternoon, we will be hearing from Ms. Teresa Gerton, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration, Ms. Jennifer Palka, founder of Code for America and co-founder of U.S. Digital Response, Ms. Rebecca Dixon, Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, and Dr. Robert Waugh, a physician leader in healthcare and technology. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. It's appropriate that today, on our postponed tax day, we are discussing how our nation's outdated information technology systems have failed to meet the needs of the American people. Rash funding cuts over the past decade have prevented the IRS from modernizing its IT systems, deteriorating the agency's ability not only to carry out its core function of tax collection and enforcement, but also needlessly prolonging the delivery of stimulus payments to workers and families during the coronavirus pandemic and recession. The pandemic has proved that the quicker the response, the better the outcome, and that the steps taken by Congress to help American workers and families are only as effective as the agencies delivering that relief. Unfortunately, the IRS is not alone in its inability to meet the needs of the American people in these perilous times. Instead of helping to generate much needed solutions, outdated IT systems are worsening an already difficult situation as Americans grapple with unreliable or insufficient internet access, useless automated systems, and overwhelmed and underprepared agencies. Emergency assistance programs across the board have been hampered by our antiquated IT systems, leaving families with delayed relief or no relief at all. The most glaring example is unemployment assistance. We are 4 months into the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and there are still tens of thousands of workers who have filed for jobless claims but have not yet received a single payment. Many are going into debt or default, skipping meals, or losing their homes. State unemployment offices, already underfunded and understaffed, were left completely unprepared for the massive influx of need. And a big reason for that is that the fact that the national administrative funding is essentially the same as it was in 2001, and that's before accounting for inflation. This lack of federal investment, combined with old hardware, crashing web services, and the need for new hires proficient in COBOL, their system's 60-year-old coding language, have left states scrambling. The antiquated IT systems failed and continue to fail repeatedly, and American workers, those who lost their jobs through no fault of their own, are paying the price. This aspect of our ongoing crisis is not new. The federal government has long sought to prioritize modern, secure, and shared IT solutions. but funding uncertainties stemming from constrained discretionary funding under budget caps, shutdown threats, and continuing resolutions have made agencies more likely to update instead of modernize. And I might add, after reading today's testimony, that it may be another factor, may be a flawed philosophy of how to handle the whole data management system. GAO reports that while the total share of federal IT spending is increasing, it isn't because we are investing in better and new technology. It's because the price of updating our existing systems is snowballing as our ancient software becomes increasingly outdated and hardware parts nearly impossible to find. We are passing these acute problems on to state and local partners that distribute unemployment insurance, nutrition assistance, and other support to workers and families on behalf of the federal government. Federal and state governments are in dire need of solutions and investments now. We cannot foster a successful recovery while relying on IT systems from the 1950s. We cannot meet the demands of today when we are depending on software that is older than some members of this committee. To date, Congress has passed legislation that includes $1 billion in grants to state unemployment offices to help process claims faster, and more is needed. By refusing to bring the HEROES Act to the floor, Leader McConnell is holding up an additional $1 billion for the Federal Technology Modernization Fund and a combined $5.5 billion to help schools, libraries, and impacted families access high-speed connectivity and devices to facilitate distance learning, something we must prioritize in order to protect our children and educators. Earlier this month, House Democrats passed the Moving Forward Act, a comprehensive infrastructure package that includes $100 billion in broadband funding to extend high-speed internet to underserved and hard-to-reach communities. We have to invest in modernization now so that the federal government can help provide workers, families, and state and local governments with the necessary tools and resources to support our nation's recovery efforts. I look forward to discussing this urgent need with our witnesses. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking vice chair, Mr. Johnson of Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing, and a special thanks to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, as an information technology professional with over 30 years in the industry, I understand just how important IT is in today's digitally connected world. And there is no doubt that the coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated the need for workers, businesses, and students all across America to have reliable access to the internet. And these networks must be secure. Instances of Zoom bombing cannot become commonplace in our children's online classrooms, nor can businesses operate on hacked systems. In areas such as eastern and southeastern Ohio, other rural parts of the country, the coronavirus has emphasized the need for broadband internet access, period. Our students in rural Appalachia are not, for example, able to take advantage of e-learning because they simply don't have access to the internet. I've even heard horror stories from local teachers having to teach their classes remotely from their cars parked in a McDonald's parking lot because they don't have access to internet at home. While I applaud their dedication to their students, I'm simultaneously frustrated by the lack of progress we've made on solving the digital divide. It is also imperative that federal information technology systems are safe, secure, and reliable. Federal workers, many of whom have been working remotely the last several months, often handle sensitive or classified data. It's vitally important that we have procedures in place to ensure that only authorized personnel have access to such data so that we can prevent exposure of personally identifiable data and avoid greater national security risks. And we've seen how the coronavirus has heightened our awareness of just how fragile our supply chains are, including our reliance on other countries for critical items, including the dangers of companies controlled by our adversaries that are equipping our networks. We must ensure that companies like Huawei and ZTE no longer have access to our networks. While these concerns call for federal assistance for efforts such as rip and replace programs, the federal government should also leverage American ingenuity. I've often said technology industries have in part been so successful because the federal government could never find a way to regulate them. Public-private partnerships and investments in tech startups here at home can be more cost-effective and in the long run, more advantageous in terms of providing methodologies for advancing needed IT solutions. America has always been and must continue to be the front runner in technological innovation. Information technology crosses every sector of our economy, and investments in IT can drastically improve our way of life by creating efficiency, providing access to an ever-increasing digital global economy, life-saving medical treatments, motor vehicle safety, advanced weapon systems to provide our national security, and countless other solutions to problems that we haven't even begun to realize yet. However, we must ensure that federal funds are used efficiently and transparently, particularly when it comes to IT. We've seen far too many instances of the federal government throwing money at a problem instead of investing in carefully detailed and proven solutions. One example of this occurred at the VA back in 2012. Then VA Secretary Shinseki's main objective was creating an electronic health record, yet his top IT advisor could not show me a graphic of the department's IT architecture. If a federal agency can't show Congress exactly where the IT funding would be going, how the systems connect, how the IT investments would enable the agency to further its main missions, then we shouldn't be supporting an increasing in an agency's IT budget. There is no question that federal funding for IT modernization is important, but many challenges of IT modernization efforts have included missed deadlines, cost overruns, and the abandonment of failed programs, not to mention a lack of transparency. Federal IT programs are important, but Congress must focus on reining in autopilot spending while prioritizing limited discretionary resources on federal IT investments that demand agency accountability, efficiency, and ultimately successful execution. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this important topic. Mr. Chairman, thanks again for this hearing, and I yield back. Mr. Chairman, you're muted.
Thank you. See, they mute me too automatically. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements electronically to the clerk for the record. Once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this afternoon. The committee has received your written testimony and will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. As a reminder, please unmute your microphone before speaking. Ms. Gurton, you will be recognized first for 5 minutes. Please unmute your microphone. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member, Vice Chair Johnson, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I'm a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and have served as its President and Chief Executive Officer since January of 2017. Established in 1967 and chartered by Congress in 1984, the Academy is an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization with a proven record of improving the quality, performance, and accountability of government at all levels. As the title of this hearing plainly states, the coronavirus pandemic has laid bare the challenging state of government IT systems at every level. But this is not a new problem. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office identified the 10 oldest IT systems in the federal government. At that time, they included the IRS individual master file that receives taxpayer data and dispenses refunds, the Department of Veteran Affairs Benefit Delivery Network that tracks benefit claims filed by veterans, and the Transportation Department's Hazardous Material Information System. IT modernization has been on GAO's high-risk list for decades, and critical IT-related topics on the most recent list include the 2020 census, DoD's business systems modernization, and the nation's cybersecurity. This situation, though, does not surprise those in government who've been keeping these outdated systems operational through both extraordinary ingenuity and the electronic equivalent of bailing wire and duct tape. But it does beg another question. If government officials know how close these critical systems are to failure, why haven't they fixed them before now? As our government IT systems rely on programming language and hardware developed in the mid-20th century, our federal budgeting and acquisition systems are equally archaic. In the simplest example, it is far easier to get budget authority to maintain those old COBOL systems than it is to procure an agile software development and sustainment contract that would deliver modern functionality, improve cybersecurity, and better citizen service. Regarding acquisition practices, the federal acquisition regulation unrealistically categorizes all purchases as either supplies or services. This distinction, established decades ago, is too rigid to effectively procure modern technology solutions with evolving delivery models. It often leads to contracts that are neither optimized nor appropriate for the solution being acquired. And ironically, government bears an extra cost burden for such strategies because they must allocate expensive resources to maintain obsolete and inefficient solutions, which by any reasonable standard should have been rationalized and replaced long ago. Institutionally, we approach IT as an overhead cost, always seeking to minimize it instead of seeing it as a fundamental tool in the 21st century that would deliver increased accountability, better outcomes, and improved citizen satisfaction. In a recent attempt to address this situation, Congress authorized the Technology Modernization Fund in the Modernizing Government Technology Act of 2017. The TMF received $100 million in 2018 to fund modernization projects, $25 million in 2019, and an additional $25 million in FY20. And yet, members of Congress remain skeptical of a revolving fund approach to IT investment. The Academy recognized these challenges when we released last November our list of 12 grand challenges in public administration. Our list of grand challenges includes ensure data security and privacy rights of individuals and make government AI ready. We also established the Agile Government Center to assist government agencies with applying to their business practices the agile development processes that have made software development so rapid and responsive. We're currently developing proposed agendas in these and all 12 of the grand challenges to drive change beginning in January of 2021. In our ongoing mission to promote best practices, the Academy has partnered with sponsors to co-host a monthly forum on shared services and quarterly forums on grants management and working capital fund management. Taken together, these three venues are helping managers across the federal government modernize their business practices and IT investment strategies to improve operations and reduce costs. They are making the improvements they can within the rules they currently operate under. But to really change the future, we must change the rules. Today, the government has challenges with cloud procurement, but the market is constantly evolving. More things will be sold as a service in the future. And with enablers like quantum computing and machine learning, technology innovation will inevitably continue at an increasing rate. We must be ready to effectively acquire the resultant solutions or risk failures in our support to our citizens and potentially catastrophic failures in our ability to govern. The National Academy of Public Administration stands ready to assist in all of these efforts. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you or the committee members may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gurdon, for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Palka for 5 minutes. Please unmute your mic and proceed.
Thank you. Chair Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, I very much appreciate your inviting me here today to add my voice to this critical topic. A common proverb tells us that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. Now that COVID has thrown millions of Americans' lives into chaos and created unprecedented need for support, it's clear that the best time to modernize government services was 20 years ago. We have largely failed to update our policies, processes, and technology to enable scalable, agile, human-centered services. And now we find that while Congress has the will to support the American people through this crisis, in too many areas, the machinery of government just can't deliver. Up to 15 million people have not received their stimulus checks. People who may have been exposed to the virus are not alerted quickly because too many counties still share data by fax machine. It's clear that the next best time to modernize our government is now. We must invest in modernizing the technology that runs our services, but I am deeply concerned that the urgency of the moment will cause us to forget that we must also change how we make these investments. Now more than ever, we cannot afford to pour time, attention, and enormous sums of money into a process for building and buying software that hasn't worked for decades. Let's take unemployment benefits. The state systems that deliver this service rely on a hodgepodge of legacy systems and has been already called out in this hearing. At their core, many of them still use mainframe systems running a programming language designed in 1959. We're asking this technology to be agile, handling now the demands of 3 programs with dependencies between each instead of 1. We're asking it to scale, in some places to 9 to 20 times the previous volume. And we're asking it to work for people, for the questions and processes to be clear so that applicants know how to answer them accurately without assistance, for the people who administer the program to be empowered to make decisions that get the benefit to those in need as fast as possible. Neither the technology nor the policies were designed to be agile, scalable, or get to yes, and we have known this for decades. 10 years ago, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies stated that most state IT systems cannot efficiently handle today's demands. Many states joined consortia to contract for new systems together. Some of these systems have been implemented in the states for which they were procured. Others are somewhere along in the 10, 12, even 15-year procurement and development cycles. Collectively, they've spent billions of taxpayer dollars. And yet, even the states that had supposedly modernized are struggling to respond to this crisis. Modernization has largely failed in these cases and will continue to fail as long as these projects and others that support other very needed benefits follow the basic recipe of large, slow government procurement and development done in the conventional model. By definition, you cannot modernize if the project takes over a decade. By definition, and you cannot modernize by simply moving legacy policies and practices that have accumulated over decades to slightly less outdated technology platforms. True modernization breaks down the silos between policy, technology, and other disciplines so that the service itself can be co-designed to work for its users and the people who administer in it. True modernization means that services provide real-time data about their usage and that program administrators analyze that data to understand what's working, what's not working, and what can be done about it so that it can get constantly better. These agile human-centered models for developing government software systems work. When public servants are allowed to use them, these models reduce risk and the projects that use them cost less and deliver results faster. These models are currently in use at all levels of government at places like the United States Digital Service, GSA's 18F, Kessel Run at the Air Force, Defense Digital Service, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Several states also have stood up their own digital service teams. But the vast majority of government technology projects still do things the old way. Why? A common belief, or perhaps an excuse, is that Congress dictates the old model and will punish any deviation from how it's always been done. To fix this, Congress will need to be more than a checkbook. This body will have to become a staunch and visible ally of hybrid tech policy teams who practice agile development and user-centered design wherever they exist. To use a metaphor beloved by my former boss, Todd Park, we need to stop arming the empire and start arming the rebels. Stop pouring millions of dollars into projects everyone knows will fail. Fund the USDS and the state digital services who can help others across government successfully implement these practices. This is not just the next best time to truly modernize government services. It is our last chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Polka, for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Dixon for 5 minutes. Please unmute your mic and proceed. If you have it, Ms. Dixon.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Rebecca Dixon, Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, NELP. The challenges facing workers seeking access to unemployment insurance payments is an issue that NELP has been working on for many years. I appreciate the committee's work to ensure robust UI access for millions of workers and job seekers, especially underpaid Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, and workers of color. The current unemployment surge poses an unprecedented challenge. Although new claims peaked at 6.6 million this spring, states are still processing upwards of 2 million claims a week, which is twice the highest week in history. Workers are understandably frustrated. During the course of this pandemic, it has been impossible to ignore the human suffering from workers unsuccessfully attempting to access UI. Entire online systems crashed in several states. Workers trying to contact the agency with questions about online applications have been unable to get through. Some report calling dozens of times a day. Claimants were confused about how to check the status of their claim and were left in limbo for weeks. States had difficulty reprogramming their systems to provide expanded benefits. In some states, that took up to a month and a half to establish the online application process for the new pandemic unemployment assistance. For underpaid workers, 2 months delay can be the difference between surviving and losing everything. For example, Rena from California was furloughed from a small event production company that the industry won't return for a long time. She's already had to move to a cheaper apartment, gone through her entire life savings waiting for unemployment, and now is worried that she's going to lose her health insurance, home, car, and even ability to eat. Meanwhile, the program has been especially important for workers of color. According to the CBO, 47% of workers receiving UI in July are workers of color. This includes 16% of Black workers, 14% of Latinx workers, 10% of white workers, and 14% of workers of other backgrounds. 7 years ago, I wrote a report called Federal Neglect Leaves State Unemployment Insurance Systems in Disrepair, and unfortunately, much of what I wrote remains true today. Only 16 states have fully modernized their systems, with the rest operating on, as others have mentioned, a COBOL mainframe. In addition, when states do move to update these outdated systems, we've seen significant delays in service disruptions, breakdowns, backlogs, and delays. It's also important to recognize that modernization is not a panacea and does not always mean progress. After all, Florida has, quote, modernized their system, but it was built on a foundation of public policy choices that were designed to limit access to UI. Few people realize that Florida's catastrophically failed system was modernized with a consortium with Massachusetts and New Mexico. When the other states in the consortium ran into problems with user access, they went back to work with their vendor to improve their systems, and as a result, did not have the same results as Florida. Michigan's IT system was also designed to fail. Its MIDAS system flagged more than 40,000 workers for fraud, and its accuracy was 93% inaccurate. This is a really big penalty. In Michigan, 4 times the amount paid plus 12% interest. And as a result, some claimants lost everything. The new administration in Michigan has committed to improving these systems and now has shifted course and become one of the fastest states in terms of payment processing. We know that faster payment processing is possible for all states. Congress must ensure that UI IT systems are functional and accessible. Specifically, NELP recommends funding modernization requiring input from workers and advocates from beginning to end, and comprehensive user testing to ensure participation from Black people who face the most barriers and all communities of color. We also want to include those who are on the other side of the digital divide, people with limited English proficiency, people with disabilities. DOL should also create a unit devoted to IT that can give states hands-on assistance in modernization, review contractor agreements, audit contractors where necessary, and require states to document contractor performance. Creating a federal task force to evaluate program performance and recommend reforms, including compliance with civil rights laws. This task force would function to determine whether some parts of this system need to be federalized, would also have the authority to negotiate favorable terms with vendors and take advantage of the government's ability to leverage cost savings and produce high quality systems. More broadly centered customer-centered design and user experience testing is also a recommendation. There are widely accepted practices in the private sector that can be implemented here. Unemployed workers need 24/7 online access, mobile services, and they need their password reset protocols improved. In closing, the crisis has highlighted gaping holes in accessing unemployment, but it has also created an opportunity. We can build a 21st century system that's nimble enough to handle disasters and designed to meet the needs of customers who are depending on access to UI. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon, for your statement. And I now recognize Dr. Wah for 5 minutes. Please unmute and proceed when you're ready.
Chairman Yarmouth, Vice Ranking Member Johnson, and committee members, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Robert Wah. I'm a physician with over 23 years of active duty naval service and have worked in health IT for over 25 years. I was the Associate Chief Information Officer for Military Health at DoD, and then the first Deputy National Coordinator at HHS, setting up the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT that we now call ONC. I also worked in the private sector IT. Health IT has advanced in 3 major waves. First, we moved from paper records to digital information. Next, the digital information was networked together. The third wave uses this virtual pool of networked digital information for analytics, machine learning, research, and population health. Picture everyone in healthcare, patients, doctors and providers, hospitals, pharmacies, payers, government, and researchers all around this virtual pool of interoperable health information, putting in and taking data out. The ONC has nearly completed wave 1, and they are advancing wave 2 and 3. This work must be continued, supported, and funded. As has been noted, COVID-19 has exposed many needs and opportunities for federal health IT funding beyond the continued work on waves 2 and 3. COVID-19 has highlighted the value of virtual remote healthcare as effective, efficient, and well accepted. Investment is needed to connect telemedicine with this virtual pool of interoperable health information, just like in-person care. Health information exchanges formed in Wave 2 need to support public health and research. Traditional public health asks that certain diseases be reported when they're found, like tuberculosis or sexually transmitted diseases. The virtual pool of information will allow public health officials to see patterns of new diseases and epidemics before they're even named or reports are formulated. Clusters of patients with fever, cough, and sudden loss of taste and smell could be identified before we even knew to call it COVID. Funding to connect public health agencies to this Wave 2 virtual pool is critical. In parallel, investment is needed to connect research innovation to the pool to expand clinical trials and use real-world evidence about new COVID treatments and vaccines. The pool has information about millions of people, not just the few hundred or thousand in clinical trials. Sam, if you could show my graphic, I'd appreciate it. COVID-19 tests normally just have the patient's name and the result. Here's an example of the virtual pool across 6 states, combining information on 1.5 million COVID patients tested, where they display the results, but also the distribution of patients by age, gender, race, and ethnicity. This is all because there's enrichment due to the virtual pool of information that's added to the patient's name and result. Sam, you can take that picture down now. For patients with chronic diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart and lung disease, COVID has made them sicker and die more frequently. Patients with chronic diseases also use the largest part of our health care expenditures. We can connect with these patients in places they visit frequently. There are self-service smart health stations with free blood pressure, weight, BMI, and health assessments in pharmacies, grocery stores, and for hard-to-reach population, food banks and unemployment offices. Funding investment can connect them to the virtual information pool so public health tools can be employed. One network has 10,000 stations nationwide and has taken over 350 million measurements in the last 8 years. These could identify hotspots of prediabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, and cardiovascular disease targeted for prevention and precautions during pandemic exposure and connect the patients to virtual and in-person care. COVID-19 has also highlighted the need to increase funding for supply chain technology and management in conjunction with our strategic national stockpile. As we send doctors and healthcare workers into battle every day, we must arm them with medications, equipment, eventual vaccines, and personal protection equipment, PPE, to effectively fight the war against the pandemic. I hope we'll have time later to talk about using clinical data outside healthcare, like back to work and travel, as well as cybersecurity. These are complex issues. Health is vital and personal to all of our citizens, and costs make up a large part of the GDP. Government must use all available levers, policy, regulations, legislation, as well as financial, to improve the health of the nation. Investment in health IT has a high impact on the health of our citizens and a high return on investment. We must continue investments in Wave 2 and 3 in coordination with the ONC. Funding for the issues above will improve the health of our citizens during this fight against the COVID-19 pandemic and future health threats. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Watt, for your testimony, and once again, thanks to all the witnesses for their testimony. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and the answers of the witnesses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them to the clerk electronically within 7 days. As I usually do, I will defer my questions until the end. So I now recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for making the time to testify. And I'd like to offer a special thanks to Ms. Polka. My team worked closely with Code for America's Boston Brigade to develop an app to educate current and retired public servants about the Social Security windfall elimination provision and allow them to accurately calculate their likely WEP reduction. This app is now hosted by Mass Retirees, an organization of retired public employees in the Bay State, and I'm extremely grateful for your leadership and vision that helped make this project possible. Sir Winston Churchill is credited with first saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." He said that in the mid-1940s as we were approaching the end of World War II. We must take the opportunity to learn from our crisis today to prepare better for the future and to create a more capable government and a stronger, better country for our children and grandchildren. Per a recent GAO report, the federal government invested over $90 billion in IT in fiscal year 2019, but 80% of this, a staggering $72 billion, went towards operating and maintaining existing aging IT investments. I mean, can you imagine if you spent 80% of your household budget in the next 5 years not on buying new devices, upgrading your TV or phone, or buying a new computer when yours becomes obsolete, but simply maintaining the devices that you have? Think about that, investing almost the entirety of your family IT budget in repairing your 1950s TV set to keep it working every year, which only becomes more expensive over time as the technology becomes more obsolete, rather than ever buying a flat screen. Now, speaking of 80%, I agree with 80% or more of the vice-ranking member's opening statement. We need to modernize our IT. We need to ensure that our systems are secure. And we need to win the competition with China that, frankly, we are starting to lose. But I also want to point out 2 important places where I disagree. Mr. Johnson spoke about investing in proven solutions, and I completely agree with him when it comes to the willingness of government to take commercially available, off-the-shelf solutions and put them to work for all of us. In fact, my very first piece of legislation I passed as a member of Congress was a bill to get the VA to use commercially available scheduling apps to enable veterans to schedule their own appointments electronically when the VA wanted to instead spend tens of millions and much more time developing a proprietary solution on their own. But speaking more broadly about government investment in tech, if we only invest in proven solutions, we are guaranteed to lose the race to China, because China is investing their federal dollars in next generation technology, from biotech to quantum computing, and pushing the frontier forward, not in buying tech that exists, but in developing technology that does not. In fact, the Republican witness at our previous hearing specifically pointed out that federal investment should be focused on technology that is unproven, specifically because taking these investment risks is necessary for progress, but often unbearable by the private sector. The other point is no regulation of tech. I hate excessive regulation as much as any American. But the complete and total lack of any regulation in tech is why we have foreign influence in our elections, unbridled monopolistic power in big tech. And we rely not on elected representatives of the people to establish laws for weighty issues like which Facebook or Twitter posts to delete, but rather rely on 20-something kids in black boxes to make those decisions on their own, with no accountability whatsoever to elected officials or the American people. There is a place for regulation in tech, and there's much more that we need to do. My last engagement before this hearing was a visit to North Shore Medical Center, our local hospital, to thank the heroes on the front lines who have been fighting this pandemic, and doing so quite successfully here in Massachusetts, I might add, where we take our science seriously and our case numbers continue to go down. Of course, we are preparing for that to change given what's happening in the rest of the country. There, I heard from doctors and nurses who want to make sure we heed Churchill's advice and ensure that we don't just keep doing things the same way after this crisis. One great example was how the psychiatry department has had greater success with telehealth appointments than in-person visits, enabling people to keep appointments despite other medical conditions or family conflicts. Of course, modernization should happen in Congress as well. One of my team members, Ananda Bhatia, founded the Modernization Staff Association, a bipartisan group that focuses on internal reform issues that primarily affect Junior Hill staffers. We have a lot of work to do in that department as well, looking ourselves in the mirror. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes. Johnson's not responding. Okay, can you unmute, Mr. Johnson? Are you there? Well, in that case, I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw. We'll come back to Mr. Johnson. Mr. Crenshaw, on. Mr. Crenshaw, no. How about Mr. Burchett? No, Mr. Flores. How about Mr. Flores from Texas? I know he's here. I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Flores from Texas.
So I'm here to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anyway, I appreciate the witnesses for joining us today. Dr. Wall, I have a few questions for you. Let me give you the preamble to the first set. In 2011, the VA and DOD began an electronic health record modernization initiative to replace two separate electronic health record systems that were used by the two departments to combine them into a single shared system. And in 2013, after spending more than $1 billion on the program, the Secretaries of VA and DOD announced that they would not continue their joint development of a single EHR. Instead, the VA would buy and convert to the DOD EHR system. And I remember being on the VA committee at the time and was pretty frustrated about that because Congress had ordered the DOD and the VA over a decade earlier to combine their systems. So the first question is, what were the problems that were encountered that led to the abandonment of this project? Dr. Wall?
Yes. Sorry, I had to unmute real quick.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Congressman. First and foremost, I would say that I left the DOD in 2006. So these events that you're describing happened after my departure. So I certainly don't have firsthand knowledge or inside view on circumstances that you discussed. It is a complex problem in dealing with two health systems that take care of nearly 20 million patients around the world. From my point of view, part of it is, I think the important thing to remember is that there are different requirements for the two organizations. The VA, while they're both healthcare systems taking care of patients, the location and the manner in which they take care of those patients are vastly different. So I basically came from the Department of Defense, where we have brick and mortar hospitals in the continental US, but also hospitals in Landstuhl, Germany, Japan, and things like that. But on top of that, we have a readiness and a battlefield commitment to caring for our beneficiaries as well. And so we've got to have a system that can meet those requirements that are very unique in the battlefield, in the deployed environment. that the VA is more about the brick and mortar systems that we're accustomed to here in the continental US. So I just point that out, that the requirements are quite different between the two organizations. And so finding a solution that meets all of those requirements is an extensive challenge. The other thing I would say is that the DoD and the VA also had really pursued slightly different strategies about government built software versus commercially off-the-shelf software. And so again, merging those two issues is another big challenge. And so again, I wasn't there when these decisions were made, so I can't give you direct insight into your question, but these are some of the issues that I've seen that have come up in trying to deploy these vast systems for organizations that have different requirements.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. By the way, I wasn't trying to hold you culpable for those issues. So I have a couple of other questions for the record on that, which we'll submit and ask you to respond in writing. But you brought up something, you did a lot of work in the past on modernizing the DoD IT system. Can you describe for us the lessons learned from your experience with the DoD IT system? What were your biggest successes, biggest challenges, and how can we take the lessons learned from both the successes and challenges and apply them to future IT implementation?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the things I would say that I found particularly useful, that I have reused in all my other IT work, is that it's very important to have, in particular in healthcare IT, clinical input at the outset, at the design and development of the system, as well as in the deployment of the system. And I'm biased, obviously, because I'm a physician, but I believe that having that clinical perspective early on makes sure that the technology works in the business process and workflow and the environment in which it's going to be used. Left without that, the technical architects and programmers may build something that is technically correct, but doesn't fit the workflow and business process of healthcare. So there's just something important that I think that adds to the mix. The second thing I'd say, that some of the biggest successes I always cite is that one example I give is that in the last 30 years, I haven't written a prescription on a piece of paper in a military facility. That's a remarkable data point, I think. We're all used to electronic prescribing today, but it hasn't been around for 30 years in very many environments. Mm-hmm. And what that did was not only the legibility issue about doctors' handbooks, but it also allowed us to build a real-time data set of 10 million beneficiaries' pharmacy history. So now when I write a prescription of Bethesda Walter Reed and hit enter, it goes against this database and immediately comes back to me and tells me if the prescription I just wrote is going to conflict with an allergy the patient has, a medication they're already on, or if it duplicates one they've already picked up. And this real-time database covers whether they picked up their medication at the Bethesda pharmacy, 66,000 civilian pharmacies, or got it through the mail order system. And we have prevented hundreds of thousands, millions of medication errors just because of that simple change, going from paper prescriptions to digital. So I think there are some major advantages that we can cite throughout the time of the military health system. There are challenges, as you've already cited, and I won't go into all of those, but it is very challenging for a large organization with that diverse set of responsibilities in patient care to not have problems. I guess is the way to say it.
Well, thank you for your service. Thank you for being here today. I yield back.
Yep, gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it ironic that we're experiencing technical difficulty on a hearing regarding federal investment in technology. A lot of this, has to do with the current pandemic, but I think all of us have experienced in the past 5.5 months that COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of the American economy and American society. There is no treatment for this. There is no vaccine, despite the fact that the coronavirus has been with us for 20 years. Unemployment, designed to give people $600 a week, was an unmitigated disaster due to the old and broken technology unable to efficiently administer those checks to get people what they needed, money, and to get them what we needed them to do, and that's spend money creating demand in the economy. The good doctor had mentioned the issue of telemedicine. certainly was accelerated, the use of it, and a new appreciation for it during this pandemic. But it was limited because of the lack of infrastructure technology. Very, very important. You know, the US China relationship is critical as it relates to technology and who's going to win this race. The US China trade relationship is no longer about t shirts, toys, and sneakers. It's about technology. China, in the last 2 years, has invested $1 trillion connecting China physically, but also through technology to Europe and the Middle East. The United States spent $350 billion, the last major infrastructure investment, 15 years ago. 15 years ago. Not good enough. 5G, fifth generation, the super fast cellular networks that are used as a foundation for both today and tomorrow's technologies. China is beating us. China has outpaced the United States in patent production, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, patents in semiconductors. So, Dr. Y, I just wanted to ask you, sir, on the healthcare piece of this, if we had better technology in the United States, if we were more advanced in fifth generation, super fast cellular networks, would that speed up development of a vaccine and or an effective treatment for COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think what I'm hearing you ask is if we had, you mentioned things like 5G, which to me is infrastructure.
Right.
And so I think infrastructure is always important in the digital world because we need to move information faster. But for me, healthcare IT is all about better information for better decisions. And it's the role of the technology to deliver that better information so everybody makes a better decision. The speed in which that information is delivered and the ability, the scale is important. So to that degree, I think infrastructure would help. But there are many other components that are needed to be successful, particularly in developing a vaccine. And that's why I cite the virtual pool of information that we're talking about. The richer that pool is, the more people contributing to and taking out of that pool, I think is what's really going to accelerate our ability to make major breakthroughs, not just in COVID, but in other diseases. And as I said before, imagine that we could use that pool to recognize patterns of disease that we don't even know what the disease is yet. We just know there's a cluster of problems somewhere, and then we can employ machine learning and augmented intelligence to sort that out. So I think, yes, I would support better infrastructure, but it's really what that infrastructure supports, which is this grander pool of information.
Final question, Doctor. Vaccine development traditionally is a process that takes about 10 to 15 years. The fastest vaccine that was developed for Ebola, and that took 5 years and manufactured later by Merck. I'm concerned that the hope for a vaccine in the first quarter of next year and the reality, I'm concerned they cannot be reconciled. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, vaccines are not my area of expertise. I'm an OBGYN and infertility specialist with microsurgery, so I just want to put that as a caveat. But yes, I think we are all very optimistic about the ability of our scientists to develop a vaccine that is effective and safe in a very short period of time. The things that encourage us are there are new technologies that were not present previously in terms of understanding genetic structure and protein structure. And so that, I believe, will in fact accelerate our ability to develop an effective vaccine. And also, going back to what I said about real world evidence, we have a way of monitoring that we don't previously use. Clinical trials usually enroll patients. Now we can look at the real world behavior of many millions of patients, either using a treatment or a vaccine. So I'm encouraged by that as well.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Can you hear me now? Good deal. I've got to get on another call real quick, but I've got one question I just asked the entire committee, the group. What are the federal barriers to your all's progress? And are there any federal regulations that serve as barriers to the successful IT implementation?
Congressman, perhaps I can take a first cut at that. From the federal level, there are a number of procurement flexibilities that could potentially allow organizations to make intentional investments in IT modernization, including working capital funds, CMF, and revolving funds. But one of the critical issues, or maybe two of the critical issues, are while Congress has passed flexibilities in procurement, we remain constrained by a couple of key features. One is the CBO scoring rules, which require the full cost of an IT investment to be recognized in the first year and don't allow the consideration of offsets and future savings to be applied as a discount. So IT investment looks extraordinarily large and must be fully accommodated in the very first year for which it's planned. The second is the audit rules, the GAO audit rules, which mitigate against flexibility. I would say probably rightly so, but there's a strong perception that the old ways of buying either supplies or services are what remain acceptable even in the face of congressional flexibility and procurement authorities. So as Congress is thinking about alternative tools and flexibilities, I think one of the key features would be engaging with CBO and GAO to encourage their flexibility in terms of how they score and how they audit those procurement decisions.
Ms. Palka, do you want to take a shot at that?
I would love to, thank you. I agree with everything Ms. Gerten said. Would add, I think some of what needs to change, as I mentioned and as outlined in the written testimony, is practice over regulation, but practices don't change because people are worried about being called in front of Congress. And I think if this body can demonstrate that they will support those who take innovative approaches, that will change over time. As one example, most procurement officers, will insist on putting something in a procurement that says only a company who has done a project of this size in the past, and there's a lot of restrictions around this and many caveats, can successfully bid on this. Well, that's very anti-competitive, and it really means that that project will only then be able to go to probably 2 companies. We know exactly how that project will end up, and that is one of the hallmarks of this sort of death march towards a mega project that will fail that we see. And I think, I don't know, and maybe Ms. Gerten can help me understand if that's a regulation that needs to be removed, but I think it's a decision that contractors make, contracting officers will make, that if they can be supported to feel that that is not a necessary, many contracting officers are happy not to include it, but that they won't be punished for not including a requirement like that. That is one environmental, it's sort of the environment that can change. I think particular to unemployment insurance, because it's the topic, one of the major topics here, and obviously such a crisis in our country right now. There is no safe harbor for departments of labor at the state level and workers there to be able to say, I have done my best to make an eligibility determination about this individual who is applying for this benefit. And I'm now going to award that benefit without any fear of being told later that my decision was wrong. We need to meet much clearer guidance and probably much more specific and useful tools that every state can use, where much like E-Verify, which you can use to say, I have checked this person, they're eligible for employment, and now I have safe harbor to make this decision. We need sort of a set of tools that we can give every state. This would be a federal investment that could say, I have run this person through this particular tool. I know that they are eligible, that we have checked their income, that they have not applied in another state, and there is no fraud happening here. And that will significantly increase the speed of determination and the delivery of unemployment benefits. And that is an important thing that I think we should consider at a federal level.
Okay, thank you so much,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. I yield none of my time to Jimmy Panetta and Gilby. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dixon, I want to see if you can help me with this. At the end of April, we saw that the Department of Labor reauthorized its IT modernization checklist in the face of the skyrocketing unemployment numbers, the service disruptions, massive processing backlog. The checklist is originally from 2017, but states to for states to ensure that all necessary systems function are available before the launch of new unemployment benefit programs. But it's my understanding that DOL does not keep track or monitor the progress of states' UI modernization initiatives, and it does not have any enforcement mechanism that specifically targets current systems failures. And is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We know that this checklist is there, but it's really just a list of tasks, and it doesn't really tell the states how to accomplish what they need to accomplish. You could actually write a manual about each business process that's on the checklist, so it is insufficient. And it is
So
true that
that
DOL.
was really my next question. Then you would say, my question was, is this checklist enough to ensure that states make sufficient progress? And your answer is clearly no to that. So what else does the Department of Labor and the administration have to do to ensure that unemployment system is up and running before new benefits are rolled out?
The DOL really needs to create a specialized unit for IT and phone inside the agency. So they need to have infrastructure in the agency to provide states with more guidance, to help states find economies of scale as they do these modernization projects. So it needs to take a much more active role and to create standards. There are actually very few standards around customer service for UI. There is not a standard that says all calls must be answered in 90 minutes or anything. So we manage what we measure. So having more measurement is really important.
So the CARES Act provided a temporary expansion of unemployment compensation to help the millions of workers who are furloughed, laid off, without work due to no fault of their own because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This expansion is set to expire on July 31st, coming right up. I have seen reports that it will take weeks to restart this program if it lapses, even in states with modernized technology. Will it be a technological problem if the $600 pandemic unemployment compensation rule compensation runs out and is not extended before the deadline?
You are absolutely correct. What we're hearing is that it would take states 2 to 3 weeks to get back up and reprogram. So that would lead to a delay, an unnecessary delay for folks who are depending on these benefits as a lifeline.
So is this really a technological problem that we're facing, or is it just a decision about extending the benefits?
I think that the two are intertwined. We definitely do need to make a decision and make a people-centered decision about supporting workers who have lost their jobs in this pandemic. And it's not just technology, but also the decisions that are behind the choices we make in technology. And so putting people first, developing customer-centered systems instead of more efficient systems is important.
Yeah, thank you. My time is almost up and I'll yield back at this point. Did someone want to answer? No? Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Kildee from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll pick right up where Ms. Schakowsky left off, because I think this really is fundamentally a question that we're all facing right now. What we are seeing right now in the unemployment issue is both a policy question and a technology question. We have control of the policy choices, we meaning Congress. We could make the decision before these unemployment benefits lapse, and I hope we do. But there's a lot of sort of hand-wringing around the issue. There's a lot of discussion about whether the $600 supplemental benefit was correct. It was done for its simplicity in part. That added with state benefits was intended to equate somewhat roughly to replacement rate wages for the broad spectrum of people who lost their jobs. But I would really be concerned, given the technological problems that we've seen just in implementing the $600 uniform benefit, I would really be concerned with challenging states to somehow implement a replacement wage system when we're talking about tens and tens of millions of people who are struggling with this problem. And I reject out of hand the idea that the $600 is what's keeping people from going back to work. What's, for the most part, keeping people from going back to work is either there's no work to go back to, or they're afraid, naturally, to go back into the workplace when they are at risk of contracting this really dangerous and deadly disease. So I guess I would be interested in what you all see, maybe starting with you, Ms. Dixon, because you did rightfully point out that in Michigan, while we've made improvements, we made improvements from a horrible system that at one point in time, under the previous administration, essentially charged 20,000 people with unemployment fraud because they had a lousy system. And we've had to make up for that. And the current governor has been attempting to do that. But can you talk about the challenges that the states would have to go through in order to calculate and come up with a replacement rate basis for this federal supplement, as opposed to using a more simple formula that we adopted in the CARES Act? I'm starting with Ms. Dixon, but then I'd open it up to others to comment.
Absolutely. So each state has its own specific UI program and its own specific UI formula for how they calculate benefits. And so that being the case, it's horribly complex for each state to then have to rework their benefit formula to reach that target replacement rate. So it's actually a lot of work to get that done, particularly I think in the case where the $600 is obviously bolstering the economy in a very, tragic crisis situation.
Other members of the panel? Yes.
I think you should be very concerned. I think any changes now are going to cause some chaos. We, through the United States Digital Response, have had volunteer teams working with 6 states on their unemployment delivery, and the public servants that they're partnered with are not incompetent. They're very dedicated. They are working as hard as they can, given the constraints that they're under. But they really, the system itself is pushed to its limits, and I think you should take them at their word when they say that there will be a disruption. I think the one thing we've really learned in this technology transformation world over the past 10 years is that policy and technology have to go together. They do go together, and we need to make policy with the implementation in mind. Understanding how it will be implemented is the only way to get the results that your policy intends.
I think that's a really important point. In order to create public value, we have to have operational capacity. And I think sometimes we just assume, well, we just pass a law and, by magic, it all just sort of gets implemented. The case here is to get help to Americans. And I think finally, I'll say this. It is a technical question, but it's a technical question that we ought to consider when we adopt these policies. And if we don't believe that we've invested in the technology sufficient to allow a more detailed solution, then we ought to just keep it simple. And what I say is, before the end of this month, let's give states ample time to continue to administer this process, and then make sure that we're making the investments in far better technology and get ahead of this. The way we want to plant a tree 20 years ago, we ought to get ahead of it. We ought not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We ought to get it done before the end of this month. It stimulates the economy and it helps Americans survive this. I thank the panel and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that opportunity. I think, Mr. Kildee, it goes down to what that person on that portrait says in our budget hearing room. It's about governing through leadership rather than governing through crisis. And unfortunately, when we don't make these types of investments, we're left with governing by crisis, as we've seen through this pandemic. Now, look, I think this pandemic obviously required a very, very bold response from Congress, and I think we gave them that. We gave the people that with how we rose to the occasion with a number of the relief bills that we have passed. Obviously, the CARES Act being a great example of that. But this pandemic is also, as we've seen and is being highlighted by this hearing, Mr. Chairman, which I appreciate you putting on, demonstrates that ignoring these types of delivery systems for these benefits can come with real costs. And the attempts to save federal dollars in the short term obviously have big costs in the long term. And yes, we've been warned by the GAO and the inspectors general, but choosing not to make these necessary upgrades to our federal IT systems, we've really undermined a significant aspect of our response in this pandemic and our crisis, in this crisis. So it is important to have this hearing. It's important to learn from our mistakes, but it's also necessary that we do make the investments, the proper investments going forward so that the next crisis, we can be better prepared. Now, the coronavirus pandemic is, as we're seeing, not just a health crisis, it's not just an unemployment crisis. As I heard today on my local news, it's a hunger crisis. Since the onset of the pandemic, 34% of households with children have reported food insecurity in their household. The demand at U.S. food banks, as I have seen as I go out there and volunteer every week at food banks, has gone up by an average of 70% compared to the same time last year. And with nearly, this is what's interesting, 40% of those waiting in line at the food banks are new customers, have never ever been to a food bank before, 40%. Now, obviously, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program has helped address this crisis, but the technology to deliver this program does need to be better, and it needs to be more efficient. And I think the obvious way to do that is most likely with mobile phones, considering how many people have them. So, Ms. Dixon, I'm going to pick on you for a little bit. And I want to, if you can tell us about the benefits and potential challenges that come with updating our technology delivery systems so beneficiaries can use smartphone technology that's so prevalent to access the federal nutrition assistance programs.
We know that in particular, workers of color, so Black and Latinx work families, are the least likely to have broadband or a computer in the home. Most of us have access to a smartphone. And so it just makes good sense to optimize all of these sites so that they will work with a smartphone.
Right. Now in California, through our CalFresh program, but also with help from a USDA pilot program, we've been able to take steps so beneficiaries can use their SNAP dollars to purchase food online. If they can't go through phone, at least they can do it online. For delivery through certain retailers. Ms. Dixon, can you speak to the value of that pilot program if you're familiar with it and the challenges we should be prepared for in expanding that program nationwide?
So I can't speak specifically to that program, but I can speak to the fact that if we don't actually target the program, we don't actually look at what the needs are for the most vulnerable, we create a program that's not accessible to them. So we have to actually start in the center with the most vulnerable and their needs, and then it's a concentric circle to help everyone else. But if we don't actually figure out what they need, they're not going to be served.
are there any particular federal investments that we should be prioritizing to support that type of expansion on that program?
I think that making sure that we review the evidence from the pilot to find out what are the bright spots and how do we replicate what's working.
Great, great. Ms. Dixon, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time. Unless Ms. Polka, did you have your hand up?
I would love to share
Ms.
that.
Polka wanted to add something, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr.
Go
Chairman.
ahead, Ms. Polka.
I worked significantly in SNAP over the past 10 years through my role at Code for America, which I stepped down from in January. We, in fact, did create a mobile-first application for SNAP in California, starting with a couple of counties, and the state actually adopted it and made it required for all counties to use. And prior to this application, you would need to be on a landline, on a computer with broadband and access. You could not do it on mobile. But not only, was it an issue of mobile access, the legacy application had over 212 questions. You couldn't save your work, and it took up to an hour. And so we made something that you could apply for SNAP in California on a mobile phone in about 7 minutes, including using the camera on your mobile phone to take a photo of your driver's license, your paycheck, et cetera. And you asked about the benefits. Well, there have been many benefits. The cost of administration goes down. But really importantly, we started to close the significant participation gap that existed in SNAP in California. The numbers were quite low, and they've been going up as the state has adopted that. I just also wanted, and I think this is seen everywhere you put in a simple, beautiful, easy to use application. I also just really wanted to lift up what Ms. Dixon said, designed for the most marginalized will work for everyone else. A last brief comment about SNAP payments. There's a desperate need, I think, to modernize the marketplace for payments in the SNAP program. Those regulations were written, I believe, before the internet existed, and it means that you are not able to take advantage of the wonderful, robust, diverse marketplace of payment vendors. And while I'm proud that we were able to get some payments the ability for users to use their benefits online, there remain significant problems with that program, including that it's limited in most states to just vendors, Amazon and Walmart, which hurts local businesses. The fact that you can use it for the big groceries, but you can't use your SNAP for the delivery fees, which is a significant barrier, and a whole host of other problems, which would be solved by simply modernizing the federal regulations that govern SNAP payments and creating a much more robust and modern marketplace.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses. This is really, I think, an important topic. I appreciate all the testimony, and I had written comments, which I'm going to, for the most part, pass on because so many things have been said here. Clearly, in a typical year, we would struggle with technology. I think if you look at the investments we have not made at the state and federal government, this is hardly a typical year. So what we're facing is enormous dislocation in public health and economic in our economy, and to have the systems we have, which are, I think, still largely legacy systems, is almost criminal considering the challenge we're going to face. A couple of things that people said, though, I did want to just maybe get some additional feedback. I was interested, Dr. Watt talked about telehealth and telemedicine. I see a day, I think about just the technology I have on my wrist, which keeps track of steps and heartbeat, et cetera. I envision a world, if we could get there, where you could almost do predictive analytics, that you have real-time data on an ongoing basis going to primary care providers, or if you have chronic illness, the kinds of things you could do would enormously enhance the ability for people to even detect illnesses or things in their body chemistry before you even feel symptoms. But we're just not in a position, I think, at the healthcare side, and given the challenges they face. So I'm going to ask you to comment on that in just a second, Dr. Waugh. I was also, Ms. Bahika talked about useful tools, benefit eligibility. For 3 years, I've led a project in Rochester, New York, where I serve where we're trying to break down the barriers between health, education, and social services and have a truly integrated delivery model, literally be run by people in poverty and crisis. So they have single eligibility, that they log onto their smartphones, that they keep track of their data privacy and they control it. And yet, and people do want to focus entirely on the IT. And I think that's what we're working on a lot, how to bridge these things, how to have data sources talk to one another, how to create a data environment where the transfer of data is important. But it's also, how does it help workflows? The technology is interesting, but if people aren't working together and if we're not getting better outcomes and lower costs, the challenge is that there's so little investment. So I appreciate that. And finally, Ms. Dixon, you said something about human-centered design. This project that we're doing with people in crisis, people in poverty, is all using human-centered design, because you could have the best technology in the world. If people aren't comfortable with it, if they don't trust it, if it's not an environment that they feel they can use easily, it ends up being for naught. So human-centered design is a big part of what we're doing. And I'd love to offline actually talk to each of you, because all the things you've said today and what we're doing in Rochester, we want to be the first city in America that has completely integrated health, education, and social services. And we've been, as I said, working for 3 years on it. The state of New York has given us $15 million to invest in the technology and in the people who will work. So nurse practitioners, pediatricians, social service people in housing, food insecurity. I also sponsor a bill called the HOPE Act, which would create innovation grants for people in the health in the space around hunger and giving nutrition to people. So, but if I can go, so maybe you could each sort of comment on the challenges, I guess, first and foremost, about what would be the plan? How would the federal government start? What are the first things we ought to be doing as a Congress, policy-wise, to try to address some of these things? And I did like what you said, Ms. Bahika, that a 10-year technology, 10 years is a long time frame. And you're not going to have the newest technology if you wait 10 years to get it done. So I'm not sure who I'm asking this. If any of you just comment on what we should be doing in the immediate steps, and then maybe just make some observation about the jumble of things I just said, which probably make virtually no sense.
Congressman, I'll jump out only because you started with my area of interest in healthcare. But I would say what government needs to do is continue this investment that they've already made in what I call waves 2 and 3, and this virtual pool of information. As you stated, devices are coming up every day that are contributing to that pool, and that richer pool allows us the power of analytics to be applied to that and make many new discoveries. The other thing I point out is what I talked about before is the non-clinical use of healthcare information. As we talk about COVID and trying to go back to work and back to school, there's going to come a time when we're going to need to show status, whether you've already had the antibody or you've already had the vaccine, that's going to allow us to enter stadiums, movie theaters, transfer to another country or an airplane. We need to figure out what's the technology that's going to allow that to happen, because we've never before put that kind of importance on your vaccine status. Your vaccine status used to just let your kids go to camp. But now we're going to have to figure out a verifiable way to say that you got the vaccine, you're immune, and you're safe to travel or go into a stadium or go into another country.
Yeah. Well, look, if I could maybe take the prerogative of reaching out to each of you individually offline in my offices, because I think each of you had a great deal to contribute here. And Mr. Chairman, this is a great, I only wish, this is one of the few times I wish my 5 minutes were 10 minutes, but I do appreciate very much you host the hearing. I think this is really important for us to all consider. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. I'm unmuted, I believe. And thank you to the ranking member. I'm going to be a living witness of how important this particular hearing is. Why I'm so delighted to serve on the Budget Committee, because it digs deep into some of our most difficult issues. But let me, before I start my questioning, to very quickly for the witnesses, remind everyone that COVID-19 in this arena of needs, because people are not in their normal places of work and interaction. Technology has become, I hate to say the terminology, king, in terms of working to save lives. Confirmed cases in the United States, 3.48 million, 61,000 increase in the last 24 hours, 138,000 deaths, 787 increase. In the state where I am, the epicenter, one of them, 281,000 cases confirmed, 10,745 increase, 3,378 deaths, 87 increase overnight. In my own community, 70,000 cases in Houston, 2,000 cases in the last 24 hours, 653, 676 deaths, and 18 deaths over the last 24 hours. We are in the most desperate moments of our tenure or our time as a city and as a region, and we feel to a certain extent lost because of the inadequacies of some of the policies that we're facing. Let me particularly focus on the backlog of veterans benefits claims spike during the last few months. According to the data released in May, the backlog of claims for veterans benefits, those that have yet to be addressed for 125 days or longer, has crept up to over 100,000, which is unacceptable. So I would ask my first question, and I listened and I do agree that these are hardworking public servants in our state and our federal government, but the system just doesn't help us. There are federal agencies beside veterans where citizens cannot even access to help them do simple things like file my taxes, get tax transcripts, because the individuals cannot access their system. So my question is to Teresa Gerton, because what do we do when it comes to public services? What is your answer as it relates to the veterans crisis that we're having? Jennifer, if you would add to that as well. And then to Ms. Dixon and Mr. Waugh, people are feeling the pain of unemployment. I know that our state has said, Texas has said, if we don't extend unemployment, there will be a disruption. And so I'm interested in your response again on how devastating that impact would be, in as much as people are so desperate for the unemployment, the $600. And Dr. Wall, you made a very important point about vaccines, technology. There is a company that is US and Texas based, Griffin. What is the importance of technology in moving the vaccine research along, Dr. Wah, and doing it where we can focus on companies that are in fact US based, not to the exclusion, but these companies are struggling to be a part of this. They're small companies. I think technology would be very helpful. Veterans question, employment question, and COVID-19 question on vaccines. Could you start out, Ms. Gerton, very quickly?
Congresswoman, I'm happy to do that. As a veteran myself, I appreciate your question about how well the VA is addressing veterans benefits claims. I would circle back to one of the earlier questions about the electronic health record. The VA has made tremendous progress through va.gov in addressing and being a more customer-centered delivery mechanism, but they are still governed by extraordinarily arcane regulations about eligibility, about processing. And in many cases, we still require a human in the loop. The Academy did a study with the Veterans Benefit Administration about 3 years ago on the backlog of veterans claims and how they could reduce them, suggesting, amongst other things, that they create, for example, a robotic process automation tool that would categorize those claims into ones that are very straightforward and can be dealt with quickly and in a generally automated way, and ones that are more complicated that require more in-depth human interaction. We certainly want to make sure that every veteran receives the benefits to which they are entitled, and we can do it in a way that is responsive. And so as the VA considers these alternatives, I think there is a tremendous opportunity to automate some of those processes.
Let's get the others to answer, Ms. Gerton. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can you very quickly, because I noted that they are backlogged. They're not being helpful at this point, I think, because of technology. Then Ms. Dixon and Dr. Wong, can you do that very quickly? Thank you.
Sorry, did you want me to go now, or Dr. Wong?
No, very quickly, if you can. I'm trying to get you and Dixon and Wong. They have two separate questions.
On the VA, I am not current on that, but I would point to the fact that the progress with va.gov, which Ms. Girton spoke to, is the result of this new model that I keep speaking about that does work. It was done by originally the USDS that sort of became part of the VA under CTO Charles Worthington, who is excellent at this. And I think the VA should continue to leverage that group in particular to make the progress that they need to make to meet those benefits, to clear that benefits.
Okay, they're having problems, but I will continue on. Ms. Dixon, Dr. Wall, Ms. Dixon.
So in terms of the $600, if it goes away, we're talking about getting rid of 50 to 2/3 of the income of folks at the end of the month, so right before rent is due. And that is crashing into the fact that we're having upticks, as you mentioned, in the states in COVID cases. So some folks who were off might need to go back on. And then add to that the expiration of rent moratoriums and mortgage assistance in certain states. It's just a really horrible time to add on top of that 2 to 3 weeks delay to change the program because we want to reduce the amount.
And if there's time, I'll just very quickly talk about vaccines.
Dr. Wall, quickly, thank you. Dr. Wall, quickly as it relates to vaccines, small companies.
Yeah, so just as it relates to vaccines, I'll go back to my original comment about waves 2 and 3. These virtual pools of information that we have on our patients are going to be very helpful in accelerating our development and finalizing vaccines. And the US companies will have access to this primarily. So once it is out there, we'll be able to monitor those patients through this virtual pool of information in a way we previously could not through classic clinical trials.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your, Dr. Wall, thank you for your indulgence. I just want to put on the record my question about the Veterans Administration, because I don't think I was here clear. They are backlog, and I will write a letter about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, absolutely. Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since February of this year, more than 1 in 4 Nevada workers have lost their jobs statewide, pushing the state's unemployment rate to 30.1%. That's the highest level ever reported by any state in modern history, and generating an unemployment insurance caseload orders of magnitude higher than anything the state has witnessed previously. I've heard directly from my constituents during regular telephone town halls during this pandemic, in which so many of them have expressed their frustrations about how difficult it has been to navigate the unemployment system. From website crashes to waiting several hours on the phone before getting a response, to having trouble resetting their passwords. Now, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which we passed in law back in March, included a provision from my bill, HR 6199, the Emergency Unemployment Insurance Stabilization and Access Act, which provided $1 billion in grants to state unemployment offices. Nevada received a little over $10 million. Those grants have been used to increase staffing, update information technology systems, and process the onslaught of unemployment insurance claims that have been coming in. We have provided $1 billion to states. I do not think we realized how difficult it would be for state UI offices to produce on such an outdated technology system. And I've had many calls with Nevada's State Unemployment Office about the issues, and I know that Nevada is not alone. So Ms. Curtin, Ms. Palka, and Ms. Dixon, can any of you explain why states have struggled to update their unemployment forms and payment systems under the federal pandemic unemployment compensation program? I'm particularly interested to know the various steps unemployment offices had to take in order to even upgrade their systems with the Department of Labor. Ms. Palka?
I think I spoke over my colleague, Ms. Dixon, earlier, so let her take the lead this time.
One of the important things is making sure that, and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought when you were speaking.
Well, your testimony pointed out that the national administrative funding for UI systems is essentially unchanged from almost 20 years ago.
Right.
And so my question is, what could the states have been able to do without the support from the Department of Labor to set those standards and even to recommend the type of systems that should have been put in place?
We have the system that we have invested in. So we haven't invested in it. And we know that as the chairman mentioned at the top, that the same funding from 2001 in terms of administrative funding, there is no dedicated funding for IT in particular. So states are having to try to squeeze that out of what they do get. So we do need to actually take this seriously and have dedicated funding and a plan to get all the systems modernized, including those standards. So doing it in a way where we are putting people first and we want to know how are they interacting with the system? Do we need to simplify the questions? There's lots of things that we can do to marry the policy with the funding.
Ms. Palka?
To your specific question of what is it taking to update these systems, I think I'd just provide a little bit of detail. You have these systems that have really accrued over decades. We think of them as archaeological layers where people have made tweaks to an original system from many, many years ago over and over and over again. And so when you're asking them to update, it is not simple. In fact, in many cases, you have either just one employee left who remembers how this script was written or that script was written and how to actually do something and make this change. And in some places you have sort of nobody left who knows how to do it, or they're relying on a vendor that, again, that speaks to the costs of maintenance of these systems that has come up earlier in these hearings. But the complexity of these changes really cannot be overstated.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating, especially for the gig workers, the independent contractors, the employers or the companies that they worked for can't even submit verification. And I loved your idea about establishing a nationwide verification system, something like E-Verify for companies that are national or multinational in order to verify the wages that were paid to those employees. That is the biggest issue that we're facing here in Nevada. There has been no guidance provided by the Department of Labor, or little guidance. There is no recommendation for the types of systems that would actually work. And so we have a piecemeal approach in 50 different states, and it's all outdated, it's all antiquated, and yet Congress appropriated $1 billion. So we need to move this forward and create solutions now while we address the longer term kind of systemic issues. So I know my time is up. I did want to just raise one point, Mr. Chairman, and I'll submit it for the record, but under Department of Agriculture, children and families that are eligible for SNAP or free and reduced meals based on their income eligibility, that information is not shared with the Department of Education in order for them to get free internet service. And that is contributing to the digital divide. And again, it's something that Congress can fix. It's something that through guidance from our federal agencies, we can address. And I hope that my colleagues would work with us to improve that for our children and families in this country right now during this pandemic. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the, I guess who is the acting ranking member now, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 10 minutes. Is Mr. Woodall? We're not getting your audio. If you want to be on, if you want the staff to unmute, you just nod.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
There we go. Yes. We hear you, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, we hear you. We did.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the indulgence. It's easier to do this from my living room than it is from your committee room, and I don't blame you for that. I credit the living room environment that we've all gotten used to. Dr. Wah, I want to start with you. I think about all the crises and the responses that have been talked about today, and then I think about what HHS did in response to that crisis. We're going to promote telemedicine. We're going to allow telemedicine to be used in ways we didn't allow before. But we're only going to do that through the end of the crisis. Tell me about some of the problems that we have seen in the expansion of telehealth within the Medicare system over the past 3 months that would lead us to want to pull that system back instead of make that expansion permanent.
Thank you, Congressman. I think first and foremost is what I said before, is that we need to make sure that the telemedicine visits are the same as in-person visits and that they're connected to our virtual pool of information that I talked about. So one thing is we don't want them to be isolated so that they're not getting information out of the pool to help the telemedicine appointment be richer and better. And when the appointment is finished, they need to put information back into the pool. So that would be consistent with my waves 2 and 3. But the other thing that people have been concerned about with telemedicine, and I think it is imminently solvable, is this issue is whether or not it's going to open the door to fraud and abuse. I think overuse of telemedicine is very unlikely. It is no more likely that we're going to overuse telemedicine than we're going to overuse inpatient, in-person use of healthcare. Very rarely do people wake up and say, I feel like calling my doctor 6 times this week. So I don't think it's going to be overused. But that is a concern, and I think there are ways to put constraints on that and put guardrails on it so it doesn't become a problem. But I think it is recognized that it is safe, it is effective, and it is very well accepted to use telemedicine. It's been around for over 20 years, but it's really come to be highly useful in this environment when face-to-face interaction is so much more challenging.
I have concerns about our desire to make sure things are qualitatively the same. We have opportunities to expand access, and I don't expect my telemedicine visit to be qualitatively the same. If I used to have to get in the car, drive 4.5 hours, sit in the waiting room for an hour, and get back in the car, drive 4.5 hours back home, I'd be willing to accept something that's slightly different as long as my family decides that it's a superior value, my constituents' family decides it's a superior value. We, as Ms. Dixon said earlier, we have the systems in place that we have paid for. We have created a set of expectations around the in-person healthcare visits that we are trying to replicate. As we think about what we're doing this year, next year, 10 years from now, how important is it that we stay tethered to that I want it to be qualitatively the same, as opposed to I want to utilize it for what it is, and then I want to utilize something else for what it isn't?
Yeah, I'd love to use this as a comment that one of the things that I think would solve a number of things is we've talked a lot about the historic fee-for-service system of medicine where we pay for everything we use and as we use it. But if we move, as we're trying to value-based care, where it's, as you said, the outcome for you and your family is the prize. It's not how many times you visited or how many issues you had. It's, are you and your family getting healthy and staying healthy? That's what we pay for, and that's what we incentivize. Then the private sector will find ways to achieve that goal. And it'll be a mix of in-person care and virtual care, but it will get to the end goal of you and your family being healthier and better. And if we do that, all of these things that we're talking about will be driven by competition to make sure that the marketplace meets that need to deliver the best product to you and your family so you're healthier and better because of it.
Well, Ms. Polka was right when she described the archaeological dig that is our computer systems today. I'm going to use that again. We can't change things without being intentional. The Bush administration tried, the Obama administration tried. If you'd asked me a decade ago if our EHR mandate was going to have me in 2020 without the ability to walk into any physician's office anywhere in the nation and have my records transferred in real time, I'd have said, no, of course we're going to have that kind of functionality. We were intentional. We provided incentives, we provided penalties, we gave a 5-year lead time, and here we are without the functionality that we desired. Now tell me where the failure was. You just lauded the private sector and its ability to solve problems, We've all talked about the government's need to be intentional in this space. I thought that we combined those two in the EHR mandate, but we have not met my expectations. Tell me a little bit about where we went wrong and what we should be doing differently going forward.
I'm sorry, were you addressing that to Ms. Polka or myself?
I think you're addressing Ms. Polka.
Dr. Waugh, I was directing it to you. Ms. Polka has identified the flaw.
Oh, okay.
But in the case of EHR, we started from scratch. We didn't have the archaeological dig problem. We said we're going to walk in on day one. We want everybody to go out and buy a brand new system, and we're going to create a real tangible benefit in terms of quality and cost for the American healthcare public.
Yeah, so I think we did accomplish what I called wave one, which was to get off of the paper record system, which we sometimes forget how bad that was. When you want to talk about archaeological digs, we used to have patients come in with shopping bags of paper. That has passed away, fortunately. So going to digital has helped, and that was a significant achievement of that effort that you talked about. The interoperability is still a challenge, and creating that virtual pool of interoperable information is an ongoing process that we're still doing. And I would submit some of those reasons are not technology, but business reasons. So sometimes there were business reasons why people didn't want to share information. We just passed in the 21st Century Cures law information blocking rules to prevent those business things that are preventing interoperability. So it is not solely a technology problem. It is a regulatory, legislative, and statutory problem that we have to continue to address.
Well, it's not lost on me that in order to provide the kind of care that we all know our senior citizens need in this time of the pandemic, that HHS had to waive some HIPAA privacy rules and direct the Office of Civil Rights not to enforce some of those rules so that we could use those modern technologies that we're all accustomed to using to achieve those goals. Ms. Polka, tell me about this from a practitioner's standpoint. We did say start from scratch with your electronic health record system. Physicians did go out and buy these for the very first time, and here we are a decade later and we don't have the interoperability. I couldn't have possibly predicted the state of technology in 2020 back when the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was passed a decade ago. So what would you advise us to do as legislators to mandate enough on the front end to achieve our goals, but not mandate so much that we miss the opportunity for innovation?
It's an excellent question. I am not going to be as expert or useful on the EHR issue as Dr. Waugh will be. It's a specific sort of mega project in government that has, plagued many administrations. It's gone back a long time. And I don't pretend to know what to do about it now. The pattern I see is that when we are successful with implementations like this, it's because we start small and learn as we go. And it was very hard to do that in an EHR context. But we can do that in other contexts, and we've successfully done it in other contexts. But I think that is not how EHR started. It started as a very heavy requirements-driven, extremely well-funded effort that had all the hallmarks of a failed mega project. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful.
I hear that start small and go big, and I want to cast that against the concerns I've heard so many folks express about the different unemployment systems we have, of course, where we have 50 different systems in 50 different states. That is going to be a constant tug. And Mr. Chairman, I know that you have called this hearing because you want us to be intentional in this way. I hope that our efforts to solve 50 separate problems that we have heard so often and that we are all committed to solving don't trample that good advice that Ms. Polka has given, that some of our most successful efforts in this area have started small, proven the concept, and then we grew them out to the 50 states as opposed to that single mandate from on high. So thank you all witnesses for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. His time has expired. I now yield myself 10 minutes. And let me begin by thanking all the witnesses, not just for your testimony in this live portion, but for your written testimony as well. I was actually kind of stunned in reading testimony about what's a fairly wonky subject and how accessible and how logical and how accessible it was. I was very impressed with all of you. Uh, Somebody who's not as attuned to IT as many others. I really got it, and there was a revelation there, particularly with Ms. Polka and Ms. Gerton's testimony, that one of the issues that we seem to have is an issue of perspective. And when we're talking about medical health records, I remember I was here when we drafted the ACA, and we're working on those provisions. And the idea was, how do we gather all this information? It was not what's the purpose of gathering the information. It was, how do we gather it, and how do we incentivize the doctors to do it, as opposed to actually thinking about the end product and the people we were going to engage and what it was going to mean to them. And I think for the first time, I've actually started to think, reading the testimony, and I think Ms. Polka, you specifically said this, I thought of the government as a customer service organization, and I don't think we do that nearly as much. So that was kind of a revelation. I thank you for. The other thing, why a lot of the testimony resonated very deeply with me is one of my standard lines when I'm out talking about Congress is I say, we have a dilemma, and that is that Congress at its optimum efficiency moves at 10 miles an hour. Right now we're at 2 or 3 miles an hour. Meanwhile, the world's moving at 100 miles an hour. And how can we possibly make policy that anticipates where the world is going? We generally legislate, it's been my experience, as if we're target shooting instead of skeet shooting. I mean, we need to be shooting where the target's going to be, not where it is now. And that is certainly part of the issue here. And when we think differently, we stop thinking about equipment and investment in equipment and thinking about functionality and purpose. It seems like that's absolutely the right way to approach this issue. But I'm not sure that Congress is equipped to do it. So I would start by asking Ms. Polka, if I'm not aware of any concerted congressional effort to deal with this problem. And we certainly in different areas of jurisdiction, it's come up, and we've discussed it kind of on an ad hoc basis. One of the things that I always think about is we don't spend nearly enough time in Congress thinking about and discussing how to make the government work better. And that should be a primary function of ours. And I know Mr. Woodall, we've had conversations like this, that I'm one of these Democrats who does not believe that every regulation is a meaningful, helpful, beneficial regulation. And we ought to be spending a lot more time thinking about how we can, what we're doing that makes a difference in the way government functions and in people's lives, and not about a lot of things we think about. So, if you were in our position, I'll start with Ms. Polka, and you said you want to create a congressional effort, what would be the first place you would go?
What an excellent question, and a difficult one. I think that all efforts work when they have concrete successes behind them that start to actually show the American public that things can be different. So I would actually champion a couple of very specific projects that I think Congress could move along more quickly. Congress obviously wouldn't be implementing them. You would need USDS or one of these places to do something like speed the delivery of UI benefits. And frankly, the thing that I've spoken about here, where you could potentially speed eligibility determinations and reduce the wait times, is relevant my thing is always start small. You'd start with one state, you'd expand it. But you could also start with one benefit like UI and then expand it to other benefits. Eligibility rules are different across different benefits. One of the members spoke about SNAP, which is critical at this time and also facing challenges as it's had the same sort of expansion of both benefits and programs. But eventually you could create centralized service that sped the determination of eligibility across a number of benefits. And I think what's really important is not just that we speed government for its own sake, but that the people who are waiting on those benefits start to see a difference. So I would just do something very concrete, get behind it, and figure out along the way all of the attacks that come on it, all of the barriers to it, and just start one by one, use your power to remove those barriers and get the job done.
Thank you. And Ms. Girton, I want you to answer that as well, but I also want to throw in that both of you mentioned the issue of or the notion of agility. And I understand the word. I'm not sure I understand how it applies here. So if you could kind of elaborate on that, Ms. Girton, as well as where you would go if you were directing Congress right now.
Well, thanks, Congressman. I think I would offer two suggestions. We've talked already today about the importance of SNAP and the importance of UI benefits to deliver crisis services. One of the things that we have been working on is the idea of providing more flexibility to the grant writers at the federal level to allow the recipients of those grants to integrate their systems. And if I can give you a quick example, when I was at the Department of Labor, I was responsible for overseeing the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, a fairly small grant that provided training opportunities for homeless veterans to return into the workforce. Interestingly, the grantees who received our grants also received grants from the VA, received grants from HUD, and received a variety of grants. Because of the way the grants were structured, they had separate IT systems to report on the compliance for every one of those grants, which placed an extraordinary administrative cost on them, which kept them from integrating those funds in a way that could better deliver outcomes for homeless veterans. So one of the things, as Ms. Palka just mentioned, if you focused on UI, for example, or SNAP, thinking about all of the grants that those grantees are receiving and making it easier for them to combine them in a way that still provides the accountability that Congress needs, but that helps them optimize the delivery of services for their constituents would be a huge first step. It's not removing regulation, but it's providing flexibility. The second place I would suggest is sort of a back office approach, right? At the federal level, we understand that COTS systems, for example, could deliver better finance and accounting than our customized systems, could deliver better HR services. But those are sold sort of as software as a service. We don't need a big requirements process to tell us how to do best HR. So allowing the flexibility for shared services, allowing people to buy them as a service, where that service is maintained in the cloud, where it's kept constantly updated, where the cybersecurity is much tighter than, for example, any agency who hasn't had the time to invest and is running on vulnerable software. You could add flexibility in the shared services space to simplify back office, which would free up additional administrative costs. And you could allow flexibility on the front office side in service delivery so that grantees could better mix their funds to deliver outcomes for their clients.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My time is running down, and even though I have the gavel, I'm not going to abuse that, even though Rob wouldn't mind. I'm so glad that you mentioned artificial intelligence in your testimony, Ms. Girton. And one of the things when I'm out speaking, I say, well, there are three things that we absolutely have to focus on now if we're going to have a viable future. And one of them is climate change, and one of them is early childhood education. And the third one is how we're going to deal with artificial intelligence. I think it's that critical. And we at some point are going to have a hearing on artificial intelligence and what it might mean for the budget going forward, because clearly there are dangers with artificial intelligence and enormous opportunities. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's going to have to be a part of our technological future. And we need to start thinking and talking about that right now as to how we're going to integrate it in a way that does serve our customers. And so you've given me a new mantra that's I'm going to talk about a lot. And we're not going to talk about sometimes citizens, sometimes taxpayers, but always customers of the government. So, but anyway, with that, I will once again thank all of the witnesses. It's been an extremely valuable discussion, and again, I think the record of our live hearing and also the written testimony is going to be a substantial record that we can rely on, and members of Congress can rely on as we start thinking about how we deal with some of these issues. So, with that, thanks again for your participation. Thanks to Mr. Woodall for staying with us till the end. And if there's no further business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Jones.